Our studies in Revelation today take us to chapter 17 and 18. These are the final chapters that deal with the enemy. In chapter 17 and 18, we have introduced to us Babylon the Great, the mystery Babylon the Great, which is the mother of harlots. And so we're going to be looking at this particular individual in chapter 17, and then we see her fall in chapter 18. We've looked at the other agents of evil in chapter 12 and 13. Chapter 12, where we studied the dragon, who is Satan, and then in chapter 13, where we were introduced to the beast, who is the Antichrist and also the false prophet. So we've looked at these individuals who are agents of evil, and today our study focuses attention upon this one that's called Babylon the Great. Now Babylon the Great has already been mentioned in a couple of times in the book of Revelation. We saw her mentioned first of all in chapter 14 and verse 8, and then in chapter 16 and verse 19. And the whole reason for introducing her is to remind us that the construction of the world order, the world economic system, the world government, this whole construction is one day going to collapse. Sometimes when we hear about the fall of or the collapsing of the money markets of the world and things like that, we get all worried about it, but this is inevitable. It's going to happen. And that's what chapter 17 and chapter 18 really are all about. Chapter 17 begins by introducing Babylon the Great as a prostitute. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters." It says she's sitting on many waters, and if we go down a little bit in this passage, it mentions that these waters represent the inhabitants of the earth and the nations of the world. And so here's this woman sitting on the waters. And it says, "Whether the kings of the earth committed adultery, the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." This suggests to us that she has so corrupted the world and the nations of the world that the nations of the world are unable to make righteous judgments. And it's sort of a reflection upon what we see in our world today. We sometimes wonder as believers, why is it that people don't see the remedies, the things that they could do to make things better, and yet they keep making judgments that cause the world to fall further and further into chaos, more destruction, more crime, more of these things that are harmful, rather than moving to a place where they can get rid of the harm and find peace and satisfaction in the world. And it's all because of the intoxication of this woman who is known as Babylon the Great. As we go through this chapter, we have to be careful that we don't fall into speculation, because there's a lot of things that we could speculate about. There are some things that John makes clear, that he spells them out for us, and other things that we are left to surmise. And it's best for us not to take our speculations too far, but rather to focus on the things that John makes clear. There's three things that he makes clear. First of all, he tells us that the mystery Babylon is a city. In chapter 17 and verse 18, he says, "The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth." In John's time, the great city that was ruling over the kings of the earth was Rome. But of course, throughout history, that has changed. There have been different cities that have taken prominence in the world as far as being global cities. But when John was speaking, the city that he was focused on would have been Rome. That would have been his assumption. But as we go through history, we see that can change. So the mystery Babylon is a city, first of all. In chapter 18 and verse 2, it tells us that mystery Babylon is totally corrupt. When John talks about the fall, he says, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a home for demons, a haunt for every evil spirit, a haunt for every unclean and detestable bird." And so we see the total corruption of the world system. And that's what John's talking about here. And globally, we continue to see this happen as the world becomes more and more corrupt. And then the third thing that we know for sure about Babylon the Great is in chapter 18, verses 11 to 19. It describes Mystery Babylon as the center of global commerce. And when we get to chapter 18, we'll go a little bit more into detail. But it just goes through from chapter 11 to 19 of when Babylon the Great falls, all of the things that are affected by it, all of the commerce of the world is affected by it. So we have these three things. Babylon the Great is the city. Babylon the Great is totally corrupt. Babylon the Great is the center of global commerce. And so those are three things that we can ascertain for sure about these two chapters. Now going back to chapter 17 and verse 1, we see that she is seated on the water, and verse 15 identifies the waters as the nations of the world. It says in verse 15, "The angel said to me, the waters that you saw, where the prostitute sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages." So in verse 1, it says, he sees this great prostitute seated on the waters. And so these are seated on the nations of the world. The nations of the world are propping her up, are holding her up. Her assignment is to bring corruption and wickedness on a global scale. In verse 2, it says that her wickedness intoxicates the inhabitants of the earth so much that they are incapable of making righteous judgments. It says, with her the kings of the earth committed adultery. The inhabitants of the earth are intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. In other words, they're not able to make righteous judgments. They're totally intoxicated, unable to reason things out in a clear manner. In verse 3, John shifts the scene from the sea to the desert. It says, "Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into the desert. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names, 7 heads and 10 horns." Okay, this takes us now back to chapter 13, where we are introduced to a beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns. And this, of course, is manifests itself as the Antichrist. And so we see the prostitute coming and sitting on this beast, propped up by the Antichrist. And so this global system of commerce is propped up by the beast who is the Antichrist. And so we can see how these two are, for a period of time, are going to work together. And so John has shifted the scene now from the sea to the desert. These two form a demonic alliance to bring about world domination. The beast uses her beauty to deceive the nations of the world, and only the saints stand in the way. Now, if we drop down in verse 5, it says, "This was the title that was written on her forehead, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes, the abominations of the world." We go to verse 6, and it says, "I saw the woman who is drunk with the blood of the saints who bore the testimony of Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished." This suggests to us that the only thing that is standing in the way of the beast and Mystery Babylon the Great are the saints. And so the saints are in the way. And so her battle, her war, her purpose is now to destroy the saints, to get rid of the saints, because they are the ones who stand in the way of the final dominion of the world by the Antichrist. Her title identifies her as the personification of evil. Her task is to destroy the saints of God who oppose the beast. Now, we go now to verse 9, and it says in verse 9, "This calls for wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits." If we go over to verse 18, John says, "The woman that you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth." We often describe Rome as the 7 hills of Rome. John is calling this woman, or identifying this woman in his time as being the city of Rome, because he says it's a city. And as I mentioned earlier, this changes through history when Rome finally declines in her power and Rome falls, then other nations take over and other cities become prominent, and they become the center of Babylon the Great. So the city idea continues on. However, the city does change. And later on, John does tell us that the many cities of the world are involved in this world dominance. In verse 14, John says, "They will make war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will overcome them, because he is the Lord of lords and the King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers." So the Lamb is going to ultimately overcome the system of ungodliness. And this is probably a reference to the Battle of Armageddon. Armageddon was mentioned once before in Revelation in chapter 16 and verse 16. And it will be fully described in chapter 19 when we read about the rider coming on the horse and fighting the Battle of Armageddon, that final battle. And so we'll get the details of the Battle of Armageddon at that particular point. But this is just a brief reference to it, that the Lamb and his followers will overcome this mystery Babylon the Great and the beast in this final battle that will take place on the earth. In verses 15 to 18, the beast uses the prostitute for his purposes, but when he no longer needs her, he destroys her. And so in verse 15 it says, "The angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages." And so that's a reference back to verse 1. "The beast with the 10 horns that you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purposes by agreeing to give the beast their power to rule until God's words are fulfilled. The woman that you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth." And so this brings us to the end of chapter 17, which introduces us and personifies this mother of harlots, this Babylon the Great that is about to fall. Chapter 18 is a detailed description of the fall of Babylon, or the fall of this city. In verse 2, John describes her sin as being one who is full of adultery, idolatry, luxury, suited only for demons. With a mighty voice he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a home for demons, a haunt for every evil spirit, a haunt for every unclean and detestable bird." We can read about this also in Isaiah chapter 21 and verse 9. Talks about the fall of Babylon. Babylon the Great is fallen. And so this is a theme that occurs in Scripture from time to time, but finally has its full description here in chapter 18. Babylon represents all the debauchery that the cities of the world have harbored. No matter what city that we go to in the world, there's this underbelly of evil that seems to dominate and seems to have taken hold of every city. It can look nice on the outside. We have beautiful streets and beautiful vistas all over the cities of the world, but in every city there's this underbelly of evil, and that's where Babylon the Great has been at work. In verse 4, there's an admonition that is given to the church, to the people of God. And this is where we really need to begin to listen and take heed, because John says something that is very, very vital. In the light of the fact that the world system is going to collapse, the church needs to understand some things. And in verse 4, this is what John says. "Then I heard another voice from heaven say, 'Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes.'" There's this admonition for the people of God to come out of this system, to no longer be active participants and in the systems of this world that have become so corrupt. There's a verse that the Apostle Paul gives to us in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 17, where he says, "Come out from among them and be ye separate." If you look at the context of that, he says, "Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers." And he goes on and he talks about this unequal yoke this whole idea of believers becoming so caught up in the systems of the world that they forget what their purpose on this earth really is. And so here John gives this final admonition to the church. He says, "Come out from her, my people. Come out from her." There's this warning that is given to the church that we need to make sure that we don't become so locked into the systems of this world that we forget what our purposes are. And so there needs to be a breach, there needs to be a break, there needs to be a separation that we make as the people of God. When Peter was talking about the church, he said that we are a peculiar people, we're different, we stand out, we're different from the world. And that difference needs to be articulated. It needs to be something that we work at tirelessly as the people of God. That we don't try to be like the world, but rather we understand and recognize that it's our job and our destiny to be different from the world. And so this final admonition is given for us to come out from among them and be separate. This separation that needs to take place. So the people of God need to beware. And I'll say it again. The people of God need to beware. The time for the church to reflect upon her motives and her actions is now. Economic collapse is inevitable. In verses 11 to 19, John gives us an understanding of the totality of this collapse. Verse 11, "The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys or sells their cargo anymore. Cargoes of gold and silver and precious stone and pearls, fine linen, purple silk and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense, myrrh, and frankincense, of wine and olive oil, of fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, and the bodies and souls of men." Even slavery, that's referring to slavery. And so all of these things of commerce are coming to an end. And when he goes on later on in verse 17, he talks about the sea captains mourn because they are no longer needed, because the commerce has ground to a standstill. In verse 19 it says, "They'll throw dust on their head, they'll weep and mourn and cry out, 'Woe, woe, O great city, where are all who had ships of the sea, where all who had ships of the sea became rich through her wealth. In 1 hour she has been brought to ruin.'" And so this is talking about economic collapse. We've seen hints of this over the last number of years, over the last probably 20 years. I think it was in 2008 where there were troubles with the stock market and the economy of America for sure really hit a low tide. And even now we find with the COVID virus that there's just threats of economic collapse. We see the oil industry and other industries grinding to a halt as a result of the things that are happening in the world today. And so it's not a fantasy for us to begin to say, well, and speculate that the economies of the world are going to collapse. And that's what John is talking about here in chapter 18, is this total collapse of the world system. The reason for the fall of Babylon, according to verse 20, is because of the way that Satan and the people, nations of the world have treated the saints of God. In verse 20 it says, "Rejoice over her, O heaven, rejoice, saints and apostles and prophets. God has judged her for the way that she has treated you." Now we need to understand that the way that we as the people of God are being treated and the way that we continue to be treated is going to ultimately bring about the economic collapse of the world. They are going to receive that as their judgment. In verses 22 to 24, John makes just a final declaration against Babylon. In these verses he says, "All music, all commerce, all the reveling will come to an end when God throws her down." When God throws down Babylon the Great and destroys her productivity and she no longer functions. Verse 24, it says that the systems of the world are judged for the way that they treated the people of God. In her was found the blood of the prophets and of the saints, and all who have been killed on the earth. So everything that the nations have valued is reduced to ashes as God's judgment on the systems of this world comes to a head. So chapter 17 and chapter 18 personifies and describes Babylon the Great, and then describes her fall in detail, helping us to understand that the culmination of all things is finally coming. When we hit chapter 19, which is going to be our next study, we'll see the Battle of Armageddon, we'll see the coming of Jesus, and then we'll see the great restoration that takes place at his coming. And so we have this to look forward to. So we as the people of God are a forward-looking people. We don't look back. We don't look at the problems around us and become absorbed in the systems of the world, but we are a forward-looking people because we have this great hope that Jesus is coming again. And when we hit chapter 19, that's the apex of this book. When we see this final wrapping up of all these things that the world has held dear, and the Battle of Armageddon and the establishment of the throne of Jesus Christ upon this earth. You see, the earth is terminal. It was not meant to last forever. There is a time that God has set when the things of this world will be destroyed. Chapters 17 and 18 give us insight into that destruction and remind us as the people of God that we are a forward-looking people and we look to glorious things that are going to come to pass when Jesus returns. This is the time for us to reflect upon our priorities. What do we value? How much should we be involved in the current system? How can we function as the people of God in these distressing times? This is the time for us to lean heavily upon our God, to listen to his voice, to be plugged into his spirit. So I encourage you, with the collapse of systems that are around us, let us look to God. Put our faith, our confidence, and trust in God, who promises us that he will one day restore us to our rightful place in the kingdom of God. We look forward to that time when our Lord comes again. And so next week, we'll be looking at the return of Jesus in chapter 19. God bless you.